So before we get into this review, I do think a disclaimer is pivotally important here because I have a fairly broad range of age demographics. Today I'm going to be talking about slave play, and the themes and the content of this particular play necessitate me explaining them in fairly graphic detail, and it concerns racial conversations and sexual conversations, and in fact it situates itself firmly in the intersection of those two ideas. It is an incredibly hard-hitting, perhaps triggering, perhaps volatile production, and we are going to be discussing all of the juicy details right now. If that feels like something that is not necessarily interesting nor appropriate to you, feel free to tune in later this week when I'll be reviewing a revival of Hello, Dolly. If you're still here, let's talk about slave play. Oh my god, hey, welcome back. My name is Mickey Joe. If you're meeting me for the first time, you may be watching this on my theatre-themed YouTube channel. You may be listening to it in podcast form. Hello to you. Podcast listeners, you can't see me fiddling with my hair, but know I'm doing it just the same. Now, I'm obsessed with all things theatre, and I am a professional theatre critic that you can find on social media, and today I'm going to be reviewing one of the most recent openings in London's West End. In fact, one of my most anticipated openings of the summer. I am talking about Jeremy O. Harris's Slave Play, which prior to this most recent Broadway season was the most Tony Award nominated play of all time. After tremendous success in New York, it has transferred to the Noël Coward Theatre in London, where I had the chance to see it this very evening. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the play reckons with a lot of heavy and hard-hitting racial themes, and truth be told, I'm still reckoning with much of it, and ordinarily I would sleep on something like this to ruminate on it a little bit, but I think in this instance, the raw and early response to the thing is perhaps even more interesting. So I've committed to sitting down and just telling you what I am thinking about in terms of having just seen this piece. And if you have seen it at the theatre, you will know that those moments after you leave are fascinating and full of complex contemplation. The intensity of slave play has been well documented and talked about elsewhere. Add me to the list of voices telling you this play is a lot. And I will be unpacking that in traditional Mickey Joe Theatre detail in this video, so stay tuned. Now, if you have seen this already on stage, I am so intrigued as to what you thought about it. There will be fairly numerous moments throughout this review where I sort of offer the opportunity to input, or I pose a question, and I'd be very intrigued to hear how people respond, especially if you responded differently to certain moments and ideas and questions that I highlight. Needless to say, comment below wherever you're seeing or listening to this with all of your thoughts and feelings about slave play. And of course, if you do enjoy this review, make sure to follow me or subscribe wherever you are enjoying it. In the meantime, let's slice open this cantaloupe and dive right into what I thought about slave play. So Slave Play is, in many ways, this darkly comic exploration of the racial power imbalance between interracial couples. But by the means of an expanded thought experiment, it also covers a lot of wider ground, like the lingering impact of colonialism and of slavery. It addresses the internalization of generational trauma and the sexual implications of that. It also talks extensively about the perceptions of race and the forming of a racial identity, both for oneself and of the people around oneself and of romantic partners. And there are many layers to that. We meet characters who have a strong sense of self. We meet other characters who establish their racial identities and their sense of that in real time during the events of the play. We meet characters who come to terms with their partner's perceptions of themselves as defined or sort of willfully not defined by their race, and we come to understand the many different implications of this historic power imbalance. The way we do all of that is via the following plot. Now, I'm about to spoil the hell out of this. If you haven't seen it, it must be seen to be understood. Go and see the play, or at the very least read it. Now, the whole thing commences with a sexually tense exchange between a slave and an overseer on an antebellum US plantation. As the distinctly aggressive conversation between the two of them turns more sexual, it simultaneously turns a little more pedantic, with the white overseer Jim becoming very specific about how he would like to be referred, not as Master Jim, but simply as Mr. Now, the timeline of this particular scene does seem at odds with the set design, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute, as well as the opening music. We heard work by Rihanna playing. As the thing slowly moves towards a sexual climax, we pivot to a scene between a different couple, taking place in the same time period, but again showing signs of an anachronistic quality. What we begin to understand prior to the introduction of a third couple is that what we're seeing here is actually taking place in modern day, and the whole thing is a constructed premise. We are seeing role play happening before our eyes. These are not actually exchanges taking place in the period that they seem to belong to. The whole thing starts to show, it seems, in a handful of ways, and what we come to understand we are seeing is 3 different sexual roleplay scenarios between a couple comprised seemingly of black and white partners. This plays out very steadily, giving us the extensive opportunity to explore the very contrived dynamics between each of these pairs and what it is that they're striving to try and perpetrate in these scenarios. We come to find out later in the play that this is, in most of their cases, significantly divorced from their real life personas and dynamics. And ultimately it is the discomfort of Jim, who is white, with being asked by his wife, who is black, to address her in a certain way during this sexual encounter that leads to him using the safe word in order to shut down the entire exercise, much to the frustration of the other participants. We subsequently find out that what this is a multi-day therapy program as devised by a interracial queer couple who are graduate students who are exploring as yet sort of unsubstantiated theory. Their intent being to treat the anhedonia being experienced by the black members of each relationship. Put very simply, they have each found themselves in a position where for some time they have not been able to experience sexual pleasure with their white partners for reasons that they can't necessarily come to terms with. The play's second act, and I mean that structurally, the whole thing plays without an interval, takes place in this conversation, this therapy session that takes place afterwards, where they are encouraged to speak about what they've just experienced. And what we notice here is a very interesting immediate inversion of the power dynamics that we experienced in those early scenes, in which the black characters felt empowered to, voice what it is that they wanted, to take charge, to be vocal, because when we go into the therapy session subsequently, it is the white characters and even the white half of the couple leading the therapeutic process who entirely dominate conversation and dominate the emotional space. It's during this part of the play that many of the characters experience an emotional catharsis and realization. One of the most fascinating details is the dynamic, the professional dynamic between the couple who are leading the process and the way in which you can see them sort of challenging each other for power, and this white character Patricia speaking over her partner consistently. This evokes a frustration in her partner Tare that is initially masked politely and increasingly less so. Now Jim, who brought the previous exercise to a halt, is the first to express his displeasure about the entire thing and his lack of faith in the process, and though others in the group seem less responsive, each of them in turn has their own substantial emotional realization about their own identity, about their identity within their relationships, and how that interacts with their race. For example, the second couple that we met at the beginning of the play are named Alana and Philip, and unlike with Jim and Kanisha, they seem to be experiencing little to no tension with their role play scenario. In fact, the first thing that they express in the therapy session afterwards is how gratifying the whole thing was, that it was hot. And not only does Philip have little else to expand on beyond those feelings, but when the idea of the emotions that it might stir up is articulated in more detail by the leaders of the therapy session, he remains indifferent to this and lacks a certain amount of understanding. That is, until he recalls the details around the commencement of this relationship, that he was brought in as a third party, and Alana, who had left her husband for him, had a sexual relationship with him while her husband watched, and he sort of retroactively felt a little bit fetishized by this as the black man being brought in to, have sex with the white guy's wife, with the white guy's white wife in front of him. And this sort of traumatized confession immediately elicits almost a breakdown from Alana, who has been desperately trying to be the right partner and be a good partner, and in doing so has failed to really see him for every aspect of his identity. Alana also seems very representative of a character striving to do the right thing on paper throughout the therapy process, and they're on day 4 by the time that we meet them in the play. She has been making extensive notes about exactly what they've been told, and she makes reference to these throughout the therapy session, citing things that were said. Now, our final couple is another interesting one, Gary and Dustin. They are a gay couple. Gary is a dark-skinned black man, and Dustin describes himself as being not white, which becomes a point of contention when he is described as one of the white men in the room because he is white passing. And his unwillingness to gratify his partner Gary's wish that he expand on his identity with a little bit more specificity comes to be a significant sticking point in their relationship. Because Gary, and I think this was such an interesting inference, acknowledges that he provides context to his partner Dustin's racial identity. Gary suggests that it's only through Dustin's proximity to him as his partner that he is able to separate himself from the white community that he is perceived to be a part of, and that Gary therefore offers him value, and that in the space where they now find themselves, Gary no longer provides value to Dustin, and therefore they provide no value to each other. Ultimately, we circle back to Jim and Kanisha, with him trying to offer this sort of a pandering speech, and her announcing to him that she now sees him in a completely different light, and she's not going to be able to shake this for the remainder of their relationship. This moves us into the third and final act of the play, where we see the two of them trying to reconnect later that evening in their bedroom. The bulk of this scene is a monologue by Kanisha in which she recalls different elements of her past and her upbringing in order to articulate the way that she is feeling to her husband, who has been dismissive of her emotions up to this point. This culminates in a graphic sexual encounter in which he resumes the role-play exercise that they had been doing at the very beginning of the show in order to offer her what it is that she has said that she needs. And this is where it gets very interesting to me, because this ending I think is very open to interpretation. What it says in the script that I brought afterwards and what actually unfolds in this staging of the play in London seem to be a little bit separate, because he essentially, within the context of this roleplay scenario, forces himself on her and gags her with a whip and treats her with the same kind of racially motivated disdain and aggression that she had been requesting from him earlier, that he had felt uncomfortable in providing, and at the height of this, she scratches him, pushes him away, and then says the safe word. Now, per the script, she tumbles away and then cries, and he cries, and they offer each other some kind of support, and she then finally says thank you. Now, where it plays a little bit differently, or where it played a little bit differently this evening at the very least, is that she emerges from this situation and kind of takes stock, and he has this enormous emotional release. He is in floods of tears, lying naked at the back of the bed, and she walks around and she reflects first for herself, then observes him having this reaction, and then seems to perceive it and adjust her response accordingly. We see her laughing a little bit before she finally says, "Thank you, baby, thank you for listening." Only the way that this is characterized, and there is a note in the stage direction that the actress ought to do whatever she feels appropriate before delivering this final line, it does seem as though she might be pandering to him on some level, and that she still feels as though he is centering himself emotionally in this moment. In any case, the idea of then coming together and offering each other comfort very much didn't happen this evening. Now, it's this final moment of the play that I think is perhaps the most divisive among audiences, and certainly leaves people very struck. It's a hell of a way to end a piece of theatre. And I acknowledge, as I attempt to unpack this for myself, that this is not for me, and this is not about me, and I don't have the understanding, the tools at my disposal to really put exact specificities on her reaction and to really understand where this is coming from. And it took me a little bit to try and wrap my head around it. And I think a big part of that was trying to understand why she needed this in the first place. And there are two sides to this, because earlier in the play, Kanisha tries to convey to her husband that regardless of his own personal racism, there is still generationally this culpability to slave ownership and colonialism that he has to bear a certain amount of the responsibility for in their relationship, generations later, the same way that she feels this generational trauma and the weight of all of that. And it's possible that only by actually fulfilling that role historically that he can really acknowledge that within their relationship. And so she is asking him to provide that in order to really see things from her perspective. The other side of it is this kind of phantom limb idea where, you know, whatever his treatment of her may be in real life, she also acknowledges that this was her first ever sexual relationship with a white man, and there is a certain amount of indignity and aggression that she is inflicting on herself, again, because of all of the generational trauma and because of years of racism and post-colonialism and slavery and the weight of all of these things. And I don't know if on some level, in order to absolve herself of that, she needs to physicalize the violence that she's already internalized in that relationship, like phantom limb, until you can actually see a pain being inflicted on an area where you are feeling pain that no longer exists. You can't really process the thing and move past it. That's what I mean by that. But the play offers the opportunity to have plenty of these conversations without necessarily positing all of the answers. It concerns itself with people, and we have two characters who are academics, and we have characters who are on varying levels emotionally articulate, and we have characters who are sort of culturally irresponsible. The various different perspectives are offered to the audience, giving us the opportunity to make our own decisions. That being said, they aren't being presented without prejudice, and the white characters written in the show do have more character flaws to be scrutinized here, which makes sense for what the play is trying to articulate. The playwright also has the right to design whatever characters he needs to in order to tell the story that he's telling. Now, what could be perceived as shortcomings in the material have to be weighed against its intentions and its aims here, because I think the whole introductory sequence with all of the different roleplay scenarios goes on for far longer than is strictly dramatically necessary, but in terms of the feelings that it's trying to evoke and the discomfort that it elicits within an audience, and this happens throughout the piece, I think that is very much by design, that it's as prolonged as it is. The whole thing is also incredibly naturalistic, and there is no interest in revealing to us instantly what it is that we are looking at, which can be a dangerous thing on stage. An audience who doesn't understand what it is that they're seeing will be more reluctant to engage with the thing emotionally and can get literally restless. It's smart that when the revelation of what we're actually seeing comes in the second act, that it is also peppered with a lot of early humour. Ultimately, however, I do think that this scenario and these characters and the nature of these three different interracial relationships positions the play very well to have conversations that it sort of seems reluctant to, because it's not overtly academic and philosophical. You know, characters articulate their own personal truths, but they don't necessarily speak to anything bigger than them, or perhaps they do. But as far as they're concerned, that's not the conversation that they are having. And we have these two academic characters in order to posit some of those thoughts, but they've also been an early source of comedy when they entered, because all of the sort of language that they're using, the very self-actualized vocabulary, becomes a source of laughs. Every time they talk about processing and holding the space, and the way that they sort of infantilizingly encourage all of the participants to share their feelings, it very much situates them to seem insincere, as does the professional clash that we witness between the two of them. We don't get the sense that they really know what they're doing. And so you have this situation where the play inspires very insightful and interesting conversations that it doesn't actually have on stage. On stage, it is purely in the service of its characters and not in the service of ideas as much as it could be. You know, it has the capacity to, it has the dialogue and the resources to articulate those ideas, but instead it just serves its characters, which is fine. It just feels like there are meaty issues on the table that we want to tackle more fully. For example, we don't completely unpack the implications of the roleplay scenarios at the beginning. We kind of have to interpret for ourselves what catharsis and meaning and satisfaction it offers to the black characters in each of these roleplay scenarios, but at the same time there's this element of the white characters in each of these suddenly having to engage with their whiteness in a way that they don't ordinarily, because they are able to, you know, navigate the world and society in most instances as racial default. Again, post-slavery and post-colonialism, these white characters are afforded an enormous amount of racial privilege, and whiteness is not something that they experience navigating the world until they are forced into a specific scenario where whiteness is characterized in a certain way that they understand historically, as slave owners, as overseers, as, the beneficiaries of a racist system. But as you are likely gathering from the way that I'm talking about it, the play is controversial and hard-hitting and polarizing and does a great job in, challenging thought from this audience in a way that, I don't think I've been put at such substantial unease in a theatre before, and I think for this particular play, that's a good thing, that's a deliberate thing. And let me tell you a little bit more about why as I tell you about this particular production, its creatives, and its cast. So one of the key creative details here within director Robert O'Hara's production is this set design by Clint Ramos, and the whole thing is staged against walls of mirrors in which the audience are able to see themselves. It means not only are you peering into the world of these characters, but your own reflection is staring back at you, and your presence as part of this is, brought on stage, and it's something that you have to reckon with throughout the events of the play. But it's more than that as well, because as each of these characters are navigating the world on stage, they are also reflected once multiple times as these mirrors move to create different stagings, as well as simply existing in this emotionally challenging space. They also have to contend with reflections of themselves and reminders of how they are perceived by society, how they are perceived by each other. The whole thing is not just about their own racial identity, it's about their perception of their race. It's about their perception of their partner's perception of their race. There's so many layers to this thing, and the mirrors exemplify all of that as well. It's in the harrowing final scene that the mirrors close in to the sides of the bedroom as well as lowering down, so we see this final exchange between the two characters reflected multiple different times simultaneously. Among this creative team, I do particularly want to highlight the work of Claire Warden, who is the intimacy and fight director, and there is more intimacy than fight in the show, but there's also a little bit of overlap of the two. This, as we know, is an incredibly important creative role in performance, and, the uncomfortable and difficult intimate scenes that are crafted to varying different degrees of execution and completion in this play, they have to be realistic, and they have to feel separately passionate and dispassionate, and we have to be able to, without feeling, too sexually voyeuristic, be able to understand the difference between a character's willingness to be participatory, with their reluctance, with their disinterest. There are so many different levels of all of these intimate exchanges, and then particularly that final one that we are left with is so loaded, is so complex, is so, again, harrowing. It's really brilliant work that's been done, and careful work that's been done as well. With the direction from Robert O'Hara, so much of it does seem to be incredibly character-led, and much like in this middle section of the play, it just affords them the space in order to navigate the complexities and the evolution of this script, and their characters' alternate reluctance to share, and then these emotional waterfalls that come flooding out of them. And it's certainly the script which represents the production's most winning creative asset. There are elements about the production that you could change, and I dare say we will see other productions in the future. Perhaps we could explore the idea of an opening in which, we are less tipped off to the idea of it being anachronistic from the beginning, in which we are perhaps suggested that this might actually be taking place before we begin to perceive that it's anachronistic, that it's not really happening in the time period that it appears to be. And the scene transition out of that into the therapy scene could also happen a little bit more quickly, but then, as per the stage directions, as per the notes in the script, there is a willingness from Jeremy O. Harris for the whole thing to flow very naturally and very naturalistically and very believably. It's all just unfolding at a real pace over a day. The action doesn't leap forwards with theatrical inauthenticity. But what makes this production compelling and fascinating is the brilliant performances. Let me tell you about the company of slave play in the West End. So we first meet Olivia Washington and Kit Harrington as Kanisha and Jim. They are both completely immersed in this initial roleplay scenario. They are both giving themselves over to it. It's only in the therapy scene subsequently that we come to find out how unhappy Jim is with participating in any aspect of this therapy, really. Kit uses a British accent as Jim. I can only assume that didn't happen in the Broadway production. Perhaps it did. He is the only British character in an American set play, which I do think affords him an additional level of obnoxiousness, and it's a good way, if it is new for this production, of bringing the British audience into what could easily be written off as a sort of a too American perspective on race, talking specifically about slavery in the American South. It is a strikingly vulnerable performance from him in both literal and physical senses that avoids many of the areas where you think this traditional kind of initially bullish and emotionally indifferent persona might go to. I do think it's too easy for us to write him off as subliminally racist on some level, simply because the way in which he talks about his wife and the way he talks to his wife don't necessarily correlate. And all of this is happening amongst a growing apart of the two of them, but there are moments, and there is a moment when he is delivering this prepared speech to her where I think we could feel just a little bit more passion and admiration for her as his partner. Over to Olivia Washington then. This is a slow burn of a performance because she spends much of the play ruminating on the events that take place at the beginning, and it's in the third and final act that she really gets to shine as this character. And the way that this speech is written is so emotional, with these recollections and these ideas coming to her in these sort of disparate, disconnected thoughts, all of them fueled by a very fresh resentment that's been unearthed by the conversations had previously. She colours it with incredulity and disgust, and it's a very powerful performance. The second couple we meet, Alana and Philip, are played by Annie McNamara and Aaron Heffernan, and these two both explore this really striking pivot from being comedic characters to a very hard-hitting emotional journey that they end up going on together, because the early simplicity of them both having found the role play to be hot and mutually beneficial ends up uncovering way more interesting complexities beneath it, some of which I've already told you about from Philip. Aaron Heffernan does a really wonderful job of seeming initially vacuous, and then the way that he comes to terms with his own perceptions of his identity and what it means to him, the significance he didn't realize that it had to him in real time, I think is one of the most beautiful aspects of the play, because you have these other characters who enter with preconceived ideas about race and about their own identities and about their partners, and a lot of, grudges beneath the surface that get unearthed. He doesn't come in with any of that kind of emotional baggage that he is cognizant of, and he only comes to terms with it within the context of when we meet him. There's an awful lot of value in that, and Annie McNamara's performance that is in turn hilarious and heartbreaking is brilliant alongside him. Gary and Dustin, meanwhile, are played by Fisayo Akinade and James Kasati Moya, James being one of multiple cast members to be reprising a role from a Broadway or off-Broadway version of the show. And he gets some of the best early comedic moments. It is evident in their role-play scenario that he is going a little bit off script, because he is challenging Gary more so than perhaps it was suggested that he ought to. We later find out that he, during the role-play, had to do 2 hours of manual labour before it even became a sexual scenario, and he's a little bit playfully resentful of that. But he also delivers my favourite comedy line of the entire play, where he reveals that he participated in the thing as fully as possible because he is an actor. So of course he entered this scenario and said yes and. That's a great line, and it's dialogue like that that endears him to us as the audience and empowers him to become sort of the more powerful in this couple. From behind then, Fisayo comes out with this incredible late stage revelation during the show's second act, and it's loaded with the duality of the complexity of their relationship as an interracial couple, but also as a queer couple. They have unique ground that they are able to explore in that context there. It's probably the most affecting monologue for me out of the entire play, and the performance that I keep thinking about. Fisayo is also able to do the most interesting work in the first act during the role-play scenarios, because he is clearly profoundly affected by it and by the positioning of the two of them. There is a moment in which his partner is licking his boot, and what that means to him and what that does for him and the sexual gratification that perhaps unexpectedly offers him, and then his subsequent sort of traumatized, anxiety-filled reaction to that initial reaction. Fascinating and convincingly played, my goodness. Finally, Charlia Latour and Irene Sophia Lucio play Taya and Patricia, the two therapists leading the session. Both of them brilliantly and hilariously overeager in encouraging and eliciting this dialogue that takes place among the group, also hilariously treading on each other's toes, and we see particularly Patricia just being increasingly more and more disingenuous. When Dustin is explaining his frustrations about being perceived as white, she responds in a very manufactured and contrived Latinx accent, which everyone sort of viscerally reacts to in the audience, because, you know, for that character it may or may not be true, but it certainly doesn't feel honest. What's played brilliantly throughout the company and in each of these four couples is this consistent simmering tension, and the way that they move towards and away from each other throughout the thing. It is so brilliantly curated, and with this being such a play about people and about these characters, each of their relationships becomes as compelling as the things that they're revealing about themselves. In any case, Slave Play struck me hugely. It gave me an enormous amount to think about. I think there are some really fascinating and difficult and challenging conversations that can be had as a result of this play. I think it opens a lot of bold doors. I think it is one of the most provocative things I've seen on stage, and for good reason and to tremendous effect. And I'm not even, you know, one of the people it's chiefly for. I do think that this is for a wide demographic, because I think, you know, a lot of different behaviors and a lot of different aspects of race are being depicted on stage, and it's much about reflecting a predominantly white audience and asking them to engage with the challenging things being portrayed and with the realities of a system that we are living in, as much as it is for a black audience. I do think it's brilliant that the show is having a very small number of blackout performances. I actually think they should be doing more, because I can very much understand, having now seen the thing in the theatre, the value that that would have to an entirely black audience, getting to experience the thing on their own terms without any kind of an outside gaze on their reaction to this material, because it is shocking material that elicits a response. In any case, if that sounds like something that you would like to go and see in the West End, grab yourself a ticket to go see Slave Play. If you've seen it already, please comment down below with all of your thoughts and feelings. I'm dying to know what you thought. In the meantime, those have been my thoughts. That has been my review. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, make sure to subscribe or follow me wherever you are seeing or hearing this review, and stay tuned for many more theatre reviews coming very soon. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day.
For 10 more seconds, I'm Mickey Joe Theatre. Oh my god, hey, thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!